cooperation is globally is sort of socially optimal, but is often challenging because it requires individuals to pay costs in order to provide collective benefits. And so what my research is really interested in is understanding, on the one hand, how do we explain the high level of cooperation that we observe in human societies, and on the other hand, what can we do to get people to cooperate more in situations where they're not doing that well at it. And this review article is a pretty concise summary of most of what I'm going to talk about today. So if you're interested in more details, check this out. Okay, so the first question is just, is there a cooperative phenotype, as it were, the sort of cooperative behavioral profile that we're trying to explain in the first place? You know, there's all of these economic games that I use for studying cooperation, and many others do. We wanted to know, do these games measure the same thing? Is there some real coherent sort of construct here in the first place? And lots of previous work using social value orientation and things like that by Paul von Lange and colleagues suggest that there is, but we wanted to look at it specifically using the sort of standard economic games. So we recruited 576 workers from the online labor market Mechanical Turk. We had them play a series of different games. First, they played a dictator game where just they unilaterally transferred money to another person. Then they played a trust game where first player chooses whether to transfer or not, transfers are tripled, and then the second player chooses how much to send back. The third player, then we also had them do a public goods game where 4 people choose how much money to contribute to a common project. Contributions are doubled and then split equally among the 4 people. And so all of these decisions involve paying a cost to give a benefit to one or more others. And we also wanted to know, so these are all things that I would classically consider cooperation. Then we also wanted to know whether punishing bad behavior was part of the cooperative phenotype. So we had people do an ultimatum game where they could reject unfair offers, a second party punishment game where they played a prisoner's dilemma and then could pay to punish each other based on their actions, and a third party punishment game where one player could steal from another player in an efficient way, and then a third player that wasn't involved could pay to punish the selfish person. And we also used a measure of competition, an all-pay auction, to see whether not being competitive was part of being cooperative. We had people make decisions in all roles of all games, and then we picked one at random to actually pay out for their payoff, so it was an incentive-compatible strategy method design. What we did is we took people's play across all of these different games, and we asked, we did a factor analysis on it, and we said, do these games track with each other or not? And what we found is that most of the variance could be explained by 2 different factors. And what I'm going to show you here is the loading of each of the games on these 2 different factors. And what we see is that the first factor has the dictator game, both roles of the trust game, and the public goods game load very heavily on one factor and basically not at all on the other factor. So this is the pay costs to give benefits to other people factor. And then the other factor has all of the punishment games, and to a lesser extent the competitiveness game and the ultimatum game, which is a kind of weird hybrid that has a lot of different motivations in it. But all 3 of these load heavily on this other factor and not at all on the first factor. And so what this suggests is that there is some coherence among these cooperation games, and the cooperation games are measuring something really different from the punishment games or from the competitiveness game. So cooperation is its sort of own concept. And also note that this rejection behavior in the ultimatum game, for people that study the ultimatum game, is really not about cooperation and not really about punishment either. It's its own beast. Anyways, but the main point of this is that these cooperation games do track with each other and they don't look like punishment. So furthermore, we look at amongst these 4 cooperation decisions, you get a substantial level of correlation across games with around R of 0.4. Play is also stable over time. We looked at people that played multiple different cooperation games, an average of 124 days apart, and the correlation over time within an individual in gameplay was just about as high as the correlation at the same time across games. And also this correlation didn't decay as this difference got bigger. So it really looks like there's some stable component of people's inclination to be cooperative. And we also showed that play in the games predicts endorsement of moral values and also predicts actual helping in an experiment or a situation that people didn't know was part of an experiment. We asked them if they would give us feedback on instructions for our next set of experiments, saying they weren't going to get any extra pay and it wasn't going to influence their ability to participate in future experiments. And the people that cooperated in the games were vastly more likely to help us with this real helping task. So this is evidence to say that there is some basic concept of cooperativeness. And the question then becomes, okay, so how do we get people to cooperate? And I'm going to start with the most classic answer, which goes back to Trivers in the 70s, which is the idea of reciprocity. So if we just have a one-off cooperative interaction, then there's no incentive to cooperate. If you're just paying this cost to give the other person the benefit and you're not getting anything back. So typically people will, even if they initially feel like cooperating, they'll often learn to not cooperate in these settings. But if you have people interact repeatedly, such that if I help you today, that increase the likelihood that you cooperate with me tomorrow, then it can become in my long run self-interest to be cooperative. And there's tons of theoretical models showing this, and also lots of experiments in the last 10 or 15 years showing the power of repeated interactions between pairs of people to stabilize cooperation. But most of the really big challenges in cooperation aren't just about dyadic cooperation, but are about cooperation at a larger scale. And so so say we zoom out and you want to understand how do you get cooperation to sustain in sort of local social networks. So imagine that our focal individuals connected to some of these people and not to others, where the blue people are cooperators and the red people are defectors. Then what this means is that this person that has the opportunity to help those that she's connected to or not. And then she receives help from the cooperators and not from the defectors. And so her links with the cooperators are net gain links, but on her links with defectors, she's losing because she's just paying to help the other person and she's not getting anything back. And so the question is, what can you do to sustain cooperation in these settings? And because the challenge is that she has to cooperate with everyone or no one. It's a sort of public goods type cooperation. And so she would like to, if she cooperates, she helps the defectors. And if she switches to defection, then she winds up punishing the cooperators. And so one solution to this is to say that the network is not necessarily static, but it can be dynamic. So say that she has the opportunity to update her links to some extent. So the network co-evolves with behavior. Now, she can look at this person and say, he was a defector, I want to break my link with him. And she may say, look at this person, she was a cooperator, let me form a new link with her. And to demonstrate the power of these dynamic networks for promoting cooperation, we ran an experiment where we recruited 430 workers, again, from this international labor market, to play a repeated game where after every round there was an 80% chance that they would continue to another round, and they put them in groups of, on average, 20 participants. And then of those, in that group of 20, we randomly initialized 20% of the links so that you were connected to some other people but not to most people. And then in each round you had the choice of paying 50 units times the number of neighbors that you had in order for each neighbor to gain 100 units. So it was a cost-benefit ratio, or a benefit-to-cost ratio of 2. For every dollar you spent on helping your neighbors, they would receive $2. Then I'm going to compare what happened in a network that was fixed. So we randomly initialized those 20 links, and then people are stuck there, versus a fluid network where after every round, 30% of pairs got picked at random to update their network, to update their links. And we'd say, this is what the other person did last time. Do you want to form a link with them if none exists? Do you want to break a link with them if a link does exist? And to show you what happened, so on the x-axis we have round number, and on the y-axis you have the fraction of people choosing to cooperate. If we looked at the fixed network, and this is where the person doesn't have control over their connections, there's not this kind of dynamic network, there's no possibility for link reciprocity where you reciprocate cooperative behavior by forming links and reciprocate non-cooperative behavior by breaking links. And what you see is that in a fixed network, it's a standard tragedy of the commons type scenario. We start out with a high level of cooperation, but over time, you see that other people aren't cooperating, and so you switch to defection yourself, and everything falls apart. Critically, though, when we make the network fluid, we see a very different pattern where you get stable, high level of cooperation. And so over time, you see this divergence between the dynamic network and the static network, such that in later periods, there's significantly more cooperation in the fluid network than the fixed network. So these kind of dynamic networks can really promote cooperation. And to give you a flavor of how that's happening, I'm just going to show you a representative snapshot of a network from the fixed condition and the fluid condition across time. So this is a snapshot. In these snapshots, each node represents one person, and the blue nodes are cooperators, the red nodes are defectors, and the little lines represent which nodes are connected to each other. And so initially, there should have roughly equal levels of cooperation across the two different networks. Over time, in the fixed network, what you see is the network doesn't change. It's drawn a little bit differently because the network visualization software just isn't perfectly consistent in its presentation, but you can tell that the network structure hasn't changed. But what you see is that defection spreads. You get more and more red nodes, and also the nodes that are most central, that have the most connections and therefore are drawn the biggest, are defectors. In the fluid network, though, you get a very different outcome. The network gets very densely connected as people form new connections to each other, and also the defectors get excluded. They get pushed to the edges of the network, they have significantly fewer connections, and therefore it creates an incentive to cooperate. So when the networks are dynamic, that's great. You can get good outcomes. We also wanted to know in a follow-up project, can you get cooperation even when networks are static? And there's a huge amount of theoretical work from evolutionary game theory showing that static networks can promote cooperation. But recently, there have been a number of lab experiments that compare cooperation on static networks versus networks where people are randomly shuffled, and so they're not in a sort of fixed position on the network. And they have almost universally found that the networks don't promote cooperation. And so there's a sort of emerging consensus that although static networks might promote cooperation in theory, for actual human cooperation, static networks aren't useful. But we realized that most of these experiments didn't account for a particular specific quantitative theory from evolutionary game theory, which said that a quantitative prediction, it's not necessarily that you will always get networks promoting cooperation, but there's a very specific rule from work by Martin Novak in Nature in 2006, which is that in order for cooperation to succeed on networks, you need the benefit to cost ratio of cooperation to be greater than the average number of neighbors. And that condition wasn't satisfied in most of these previous studies. So we wanted to test it. And we, again on MTurk, we got groups of 24.2 on average to play 15-round games. And here we just didn't tell them any information about how long the game was to avoid endgame effects. And we had them play on cycles where they were connected to either 2 people, so 1 on each side, 4 people, or 6 people. So here we're varying the average number of neighbors. And then we gave them the opportunity to pay 10 units for each neighbor in order for each neighbor to gain 10 times the benefit to cost ratio, which we varied across 2, 4, and 6. So sometimes you would pay 10 to give each neighbor 20, sometimes you would pay 10 to give each neighbor 40 or 60. And so now we can investigate this prediction about the relationship between the benefit to cost ratio and the number of neighbors. And critically, after people made their decisions, they were informed about what action each of their neighbors took, and also the total payoff of each of their neighbors, which allows them to do the kind of imitation style learning that is what drives evolutionary game theory models, where the assumption is that people copy the strategies of those that are doing well. And what we find is, so the prediction is that you'll get stable cooperation when the benefit to cost ratio is greater than the average of numbers of neighbors, and you won't if not. And so what I'm going to show you is the fraction of people cooperating as a function of round when that condition is satisfied and when it's not. And what you see is that when the condition isn't satisfied, you just get, again, a sort of standard tragedy of the commons type situation where you just get a steady decrease in cooperation. However, when this critical condition is satisfied, what you see is that there's, first of all, there's much more cooperation, and also that cooperation stabilizes. There's a little bit of a transient decrease in the early rounds, but when you get to the second half of the session, you get a sort of stable, relatively high level of cooperation when this condition is satisfied. And to see why, look at these two little representative, they're going to be little movies of the behavior of this player in one session where the condition wasn't satisfied and one where it was. So again, blue dots are cooperators, red dots are defectors. And what you see is that when B over C is greater than K, you get this very clear assortment that emerges where all of the cooperators are clustered together and the sort of defectors are clustered together. Whereas when that condition isn't satisfied, you get lots of random mixing. And this assortment is really critical because when you have assortment like this, if you're a cooperator on the inside of this chunk of cooperators, then you're doing really well because you're getting the benefit from most of your neighbors. And so this sort of this clustering, it kind of insulates cooperators from getting infected with defection. It's kind of like a quarantine. And then we also did another one to show that this was stable on a longer time period. Here we ran this in the physical lab rather than on MTurk in smaller groups because it was in the lab, groups of 8.3. We picked a set of payoffs where the B over C greater than K condition was satisfied, and we had them play for 50 rounds. And then here we compared the level of cooperation when they were on a fixed network versus a well-mixed population where after every round, people's position on the network was randomly shuffled. And so this is sort of like a stranger matching, analogous to playing a lot of one-shot games because your partners in the next round will not be the same as your partners in the first round typically. And what you see is that, again, in the well-mixed population, you have a tragedy of the commons type situation where you get a decay of cooperation over time. But in the static network, you get really fixed, stable cooperation even over a very long number of rounds. So the moral of this is that when you limit the scope of interaction such that you are, rather than interacting with everyone in the whole population, you just have these kind of relatively local interactions with people in your local social network, even if those networks are overlapping so that everyone is connected to everyone else through multiple steps. By having this sort of limited scope of interaction, you get the emergence of clusters, and that supports cooperation. And so you really can get stable cooperation on networks under the right circumstances. So that's encouraging, but we also want to think about how can we promote cooperation at the really global level. Issues like I was saying, like conservation and climate change, real non-excludable public goods. And this is difficult because if you choose to cooperate, it benefits literally everyone. You can't exclude people that are defectors. There's no clustering going on. It's just you are affecting everyone or not. And so this may seem that cooperation would be doomed in this context, but the thing is that these sort of global interactions don't happen in a vacuum. They happen superimposed on a network of personal, sort of local pairwise interactions. And so if your neighbors, your sort of friends or colleagues or whatever in daily life, can tell whether you are cooperating or not in this global level public good, they can condition their behavior on you. And so they can cooperate with you in the personal relationships if you cooperate at the global level, and if not, then not. And so by remembering that the global can be linked to the local as long as your action in the global is observable, we realize that the same kind of reciprocity type mechanism can stabilize cooperation at a large level. And there's lots of lab experiments demonstrating this. Here are a couple. But what I'm going to tell you about today is a field experiment we did demonstrating how this can work in the real world with the real world public good. So this was a collaboration with Pacific Gas and Electric, a utility company in California that was trying trying to get people to sign up for a blackout prevention program. It's a classic public goods kind of thing where they agree to let the utility company turn down the intensity of their air conditioners on very hot days. Because normally what happens is when it's really hot, everyone cranks up their air conditioner, there's a huge spike in electricity use, and then this can overwhelm the grid and cause blackouts. And so the question was, how do you, and so this is a great program, but almost nobody signs up for it. And so the question they wanted to know is, how can we get people to participate in this public good? And so what we did is we mailed 1,400 residents in apartment buildings in a city in California this flyer that explains about the program and how they should sign up for it, and it's good for California, et cetera, et cetera. It's this public good. And we randomly assigned them to 2 different conditions. In both cases, the way that they signed up for the program is that there was a sign-up sheet in the mailroom of their apartment building. But in one condition, we said, here's a personal, like a random ID number, a personal code. If you want to sign up, write down your personal code on the sign-up sheet, and we'll sign you up. And in the other condition, everything was exactly the same, but in addition to writing down their personal code, they also had to write down their name and their apartment number, and in this publicly visible spot. And so this means that once you signed up, your neighbors would know, and so you would get some sort of reputational benefit from helping provision this public good. And we don't think that people necessarily were consciously aware of this, but there's a lot of evidence that people are, even at a subconscious level, really sensitive to these sort of cues that their behavior might be observed. And so what we found is that this is showing the fraction of people that signed up for the program in the anonymous versus observable condition. And we found that 3 times as many people signed up for this real-world public good when their behavior was observable to their neighbors compared to it wasn't. And we also looked at the effectiveness of paying them $25 to sign up, which is what the utility company had been doing before. And this totally free observability manipulation was 7 times more effective than the costly sort of financial incentive. And we recently wrote a review article in Current Opinion in Behavioral Sciences where we reviewed a whole bunch of different experiments looking at cooperation in real-world field contexts like this one, and we found that these kind of social incentives based on reputation and social norms were consistently effective, whereas more sort of standard economic interventions based on costs and benefits and sort of material incentives were much more mixed. So there really is broad support for the power of these social incentives for promoting real-world cooperation. What all of the different things that I've talked about so far boil down to is essentially saying that future consequences exist for today's actions, and therefore it pays for you in the long run to be cooperative, so that the other person will cooperate with you, or so that you will gain social capital in dynamic networks, or so that you won't get shunned by your friends and colleagues and so on. And so there are a lot of these powerful mechanisms that make it in your self-interest to cooperate. But it's also true that there is a lot of real prosociality, a lot of people cooperating even when there's no possible way that it's going to benefit them. And so what I want to do for the rest of the talk is I want to talk about real prosociality and understanding what motivates people to cooperate even when there is really no long-term benefit. And to answer that question, I'm going to make the argument that the fact that most of important interactions do have future consequences actually explains why people cooperate even in one-shot anonymous settings. So to make this argument, I'm going to use a dual process perspective from psychology, and in the dual process perspective, all right, thumbs up if I'm still there. I got some little warning message. We
can hear you.
Yeah, all right, cool. That looks promising.
We're still here.
Okay. So the dual process perspective conceptualizes decisions as arising from a conflict between 2 different kinds of processes. Processes on the one hand that are intuitive, automatic, fast, sort of gut emotional processes, and on the other hand, processes that are slow, controlled, deliberative, rational, and so on. This has been recently popularized by Danny Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow book. And I'm going to take this dual process perspective and put it together with theories of cultural evolution and norm internalization. And putting these things together, what you get is what I'm calling the social heuristics hypothesis. And so the idea is that you take strategies that are typically successful in your daily life social interactions, and you wind up internalizing them as your default social heuristics. And so when you're in a new situation, your default is to treat it like a typical situation. But if you stop and think about it, deliberation can make you say, oh, wait, no, actually, this situation is different. It's not the way things typically are. And so what that means is because most important interactions do have future consequences because of all of the mechanisms that I was talking about in the earlier part of the talk, people wind up developing a repeated interaction heuristic. And so then even when you're in one-shot anonymous situations, your intuition is to act as if it was a repeated game, because typically it is a repeated game. And so that can lead you to cooperate even though it's not actually, there's not actually any future consequences. But a key prediction of this story is that if I encourage you to stop and think about it, then you should realize that actually it's not a repeated game, and you should be less inclined to cooperate. And so we tested this prediction in our 2012 paper by having people play one single one-shot public goods game in groups of 4. Each player got some money, chose how much to keep and how much to contribute. All of the contributions were doubled and split equally. And then to get at this prediction about intuition versus deliberation, for half of the people we said, please decide as quickly as possible. You have to make your decision in less than 10 seconds. And so these people were pushed to be more intuitive. For the other people, we said, please stop and think, carefully consider your decision, stop and think for at least 10 seconds before you make your choice. And so these people were pushed to be more deliberative. And a critical thing here is this is a manipulation of their cognitive process. They're randomly assigned a condition. It's not a correlation with just how long did they choose to make the decision. These reaction time correlations are not good measures of what's more intuitive versus deliberative. With Tony Evans, who is there today with you, I have a paper where we give evidence that these reaction time correlations, they're confounded with all different kinds of other things, including how conflicted you feel about the decision, which is separate from how much you're using intuition versus deliberation. So correlations aren't good measures. You have to do real causal manipulation experiments. So we do that, and then we want to make sure that the people that we're forcing to decide quickly, it's not just that they don't understand the game, they don't understand that it's a social dilemma. We want it to be about their decision for what should they do, given that they understand it's a social dilemma. So the instructions make it very clear that contributing is best for the group, but it's always costly individually for you, and so it's in your self-interest not to contribute. And then we also afterwards made sure that they understand the setup, and if you exclude the people that didn't understand it was a social dilemma, that doesn't change anything. And so we ran this both on MTurk and in the physical lab, and what I'm going to show you is the fraction of the endowment contributed on average in the time pressure versus time delay conditions. And what you see is both on MTurk and in the lab, people under time pressure contributed significantly more than people under time delay. And so this supports the idea that there is an intuition to cooperate in this one-shot anonymous setting, but then when you stop and think about it, it makes you more selfish. We also then have a follow-up. I did a personal meta-analysis where I took all 15 studies that I had run over a 2-year period in which people had the chance to pay a cost to give a benefit to others, and they had to do so either under time pressure or time delay. And I asked what happened. And the advantage of this kind of personal meta-analysis is that it gets around other issues associated with meta-analyses where there's publication bias and only positive results get published or something like that. Here I just take everything from my file drawer. I just take every study I ran, dump it into the meta-analysis, and ask what happened. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the time pressure effect. So this is the fraction of the endowment contributed under time pressure minus the fraction of the endowment contributed under time delay. So a positive value means more cooperation when we make people intuitive, 0 means no effect, and the negative value means more cooperation when we make people deliberative. And I'm just going to, in a sort of standard meta-analysis way, I'm just going to sort the 15 studies from largest effect to smallest effect. And already, before I even show it to you, from the scale of the axes, you can guess how this is going to come out. What you see is that there are lots of studies that find big positive effects of intuition on cooperation, middling effects, no significant effects, but there are no negative effects. And so overall, there's a very significant positive effect. This is also true even if you include people that took too long in the time pressure condition or decided too quickly in the time delay condition and therefore were not successfully manipulated. And also, just to show you, to ask about the file drawer, I'm going to show you which of these studies we published. Before that, say that these also consistent with these results are some other work by other labs that either find positive effect or null effect, but not negative effects. And what you see, the blue ones are the ones that I published, and the yellow ones are the ones that are still in the file drawer for one reason or another. So this is evidence in support of this prediction of my social heuristics hypothesis that you should have an intuition to cooperate in one-shot games, but deliberation should undermine it. These same results extend to other settings. So we have a couple of papers showing that even if you're playing without group members or you're playing in a situation where it's framed as a competition rather than as a cooperation, you still see that deliberation undermines cooperation. Also, you can get it with, instead of using time pressure, using a conceptual priming manipulation, where you have people write about a time that intuition or reason worked out well for them beforehand. And there was a paper from Sebastian Lotz showing this works even when there's structural inequality, where some people benefit more from the public goods game than others. There's also a bunch of papers manipulating cognitive processing but using cognitive loads, like, for example, having people remember a short versus long number, which uses up their sort of deliberative resources. The longer number makes them more intuitive, and there's a bunch of studies showing that a similar pattern, that making people more intuitive makes them either more pro-social or has no effect but doesn't make them less pro-social. We also had a paper trying to look at this in the real world, again, where here we had extreme altruists, so people that risked their lives to save strangers, and we had collected interviews that they gave to newspapers, extracted the parts where they described how they made their decision, and had subjects rate those decisions, and they were overwhelmingly intuitive. Things like, I didn't think, I just did it. And that's true even in situations where they would have had enough time to stop and think, but they just chose not to. So there's evidence of this intuitive cooperation, but really my sort of social heuristics or repeated game heuristic idea says it's not that you should be cooperative, period, but what should be intuitive is reciprocation, because that's the strategy that's good in repeated games. And so that's to say that you should cooperate unless the other person defected with you previously, or unless you expect the other person to defect, in which case you should defect, because that kind of tit-for-tat strategy is the thing that's good in repeated games. And so there is also evidence in support of this. For example, there's a number of studies that show that in the ultimatum game, if someone makes you an unfair offer, your first impulse is to reject that offer. But if you stop and think about it, you're more inclined to accept. And again, this fits with the idea that your intuitions are the strategies that are good in repeated games. In a repeated ultimatum game, it makes sense to reject low offers because that forces the other person to give you a better offer in the next round. But in a one-shot game, it doesn't. So your intuition is to do the thing that makes sense in the repeated game. Then you stop and think about it, and you realize, oh no, here I should just, there's no point. And we also have evidence that if you expect other people to not be cooperative, that makes your intuition also non-cooperative. So your sort of intuition matches your expectations about what you think other people are going to do, whereas deliberation just is sort of uniformly selfish. Okay, and so then the final thing that I want to talk about is an experiment that we did giving direct evidence of these kind of spillover effects from repeated games to one-shot games. And so what we did is we did a two-stage experiment where in the first stage we had people either play for 20 minutes, play repeated prisoner's dilemmas that were either long, large probability of playing again with the next person, with the same person in the next round. So lots of future consequences, or short. And as predicted by theory and previous experiments, in the long prisoner's dilemmas, people learn to cooperate. In the short prisoner's dilemmas, people learn to defect. And so this is kind of like the treatment phase where we get people, by setting the rules of the game, we get people used to cooperating or get them used to defecting. And then what we want to know is, does this affect their kind of intuitive heuristic response? Do they develop kind of habits of cooperation or of prosociality that spill over even into one-shot anonymous settings? And so to find out, after they finish these repeated prisoner's dilemmas, we say, okay, now it's the second part of the experiment. You're just going to do a set of one-shot anonymous games. And so we have them do dictator game, trust game, public goods game, ultimatum game. And we did this with 96 subjects in the physical lab at Harvard, and we want to know, are there spillover effects? Is the treatment that you're randomized into in the first part of the experiment, does it spill over into how you behave in the second part, even though in the second part there's no strategic reason that what happened in the first part should matter? In these games in the second half, no matter what the other person is going to do, it's in your self-interest to defect. So there shouldn't be any influence of stage 1 on stage 2. What I'm going to show you is the representative result from from the dictator game, which is the strongest piece of evidence here, because there's no strategic reason to give, and there's also no role for beliefs about what the other person is going to do, because this is just unilaterally, how much money do you want to give to the other person? The other person isn't going to do anything. There's no reason for you to give other than just pure prosociality. And what you see, this is the distribution of amount donated in the long versus, after having played long versus short repeated games. And what you see is the people that played the short repeated games are much more likely to give nothing. And the average donation among the people that played the long games, the people that got used to cooperating, is more than twice as much as what happened for the people that got used to defecting. And I should say that also this isn't an income effect, because even though these people, the people in the long repeated games, earned more money during the game because they were cooperating more, we anticipated that, and so we gave the people in the red condition, the sort of non-cooperative condition, a bigger starting endowment, so that at the end of the first stage, they'd both earned roughly the same amount. And we also see similar effects in the other cooperation games. So you see these big spillover effects. And a key prediction of the theory is not just that you see spillover effects, but that those effects are particularly driven by heuristics. And so to assess that, we had people at the end take a version of Shane Frederick's cognitive reflection test. There are these 3 math problems that have intuitively compelling but incorrect answers. So for example, with this first one, the ages of Mark and Adam add up to 28 years old. Mark is 20 years older than Adam. How many years old is Adam? And you have a first response to say 8. But if you stop and do the math, you realize actually it's 4. And so for things like this, and so we can classify people for each of these questions. Did they give the right answer? Did they give the intuitive answer? Or are they just bad at math and gave some random answer? And what we do is we split our people up into the people that gave intuitive answers, people that gave just the right answers, and then people that were confused that just gave, weird answers. And what I'm going to show you is the average amount given to the other person in the second stage as a function of what treatment you received in the first stage. And what you see is that among the intuitive subjects, there's a big treatment effect, big spillovers, where people are much more prosocial in the second stage if they got used to cooperating. Among the reflective or deliberative subjects, however, there's totally no treatment effect at all. And among the confused subjects, it's also not clear what's happening, which makes sense because they're confused. Also, these error bars are big because there weren't very many subjects in the confused condition. So this is evidence that the spillovers happen specifically via the root of heuristics. And we also had another experiment in the same paper where we show the same thing is true for punishment, where if you get used to cooperating, then not only are you more inclined to cooperate, but you're also more inclined to punish people that don't cooperate, which suggests that this really is about internalizing a norm for what's appropriate behavior and not just about getting used to cooperating, and so some kind of like priming effect. So to summarize, there are a lot of mechanisms that can get people to cooperate. In particular, if other people are going to know whether you cooperated or not, that creates an incentive for you to cooperate, particularly if the other people can act on that information. So they both need to be able to see what you did and be able to act on it. And when you think about decision making in general, your sort of automatic intuitive responses are shaped by your previous experience, or these heuristics for what's typically good, whereas deliberation and reflection leads you to do the thing that's rationally self-interested in the current situation that you're faced with. And so when you put these two things together, you come out with the idea that mechanisms that promote cooperation can build habits of prosociality which extend even to situations where those mechanisms aren't present. And so as a result, you can get an intuitive predisposition to cooperate, but not for everyone, because if you are in a situation where the mechanisms that make cooperation self-interested are weak, then you don't wind up internalizing cooperation as your default, because cooperation isn't typically successful for you. So these are the people that I cooperate with most. This is my lab at Yale, and these are other excellent collaborators. And these are most of the papers that I talked about. Seems like the formatting got a little bit messed up, but whatever. The last one is the Habits of Virtue paper. So thanks very much, and I would be very happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Dave. So I'm sure we all have a lot of questions to ask Dave. Let's see. Anyone? Just raise your hand.
I can't hear anything yet, though, so I don't know
Can you hear
if there's something that will change that.
Can you hear us? Hello? Hello, Dave? Hello, Dave? Can you hear us? Hello? We're trying to fix that. Can you hear us? We can hear you well. We're still here.
Sorry, I still am not getting any audio.
Okay, we can hear you very well. And let's see.
I'll close this and reopen it. That may do it. 1 second.
So you can think of your questions first. Okay, we are back. Can you hear us? Hello. Hello.
Ah, yes. Okay, now I can hear.
Wonderful. Okay, let's see who's the first hand. Questions? Okay, Margaret, please. Wait a little while, so we need you in the mic. Please.
Hello. Partway in your talk, you were talking about automatic and controlled processes, and you made after you summarized a lot of data, you said, but of course you can decide to control your automatic processes, and that seemed to me to be kind of a contradiction in terms of what automatic means and control means. You can decide, which is control, yeah. And you can decide to control your automatic processes. Do you think that that's a consistent thing for you to say? I can't hear me.
Hello, Dave? Hello.
The way that we think about it is that, yep, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I think there's just some lag.
Oh, a long lag.
So yeah. So the way that we typically, or the way the dual process theories typically work, is you imagine that there is a prepotent response, and then there is some likelihood that deliberation will engage, and when deliberation does engage, it assesses, and deliberation says, was my intuition right, in which case I let it go, or was my intuition wrong, in which case I'll override it. And so the question of what causes deliberation to get engaged is an interesting question, but it's a pretty, the sort of standard idea in this literature is that it requires cognitive resources in order to do that. And so if you don't give people time, if you put them under time pressure, it sort of makes it less likely that that will happen. Or if you put people under cognitive load, it makes it less likely that that will happen.
Okay, well, that's a sort of an answer, but it does raise questions about, I'll step into my automatic processes and control them, doesn't it? At what point does that happen, and then
Yeah.
what does that do to our measures?
Yeah, I mean, right. So I think how that works is definitely an interesting question, and I think there's a lot of people in cognitive psych and social studying that sort of thing. The way that I think about it, we have like a formal model that I didn't have a chance to talk about today, but the way that I envision it is that you have the cost of deliberating varies over time. That is from trial to trial, sort of, or from setting to setting. Sometimes you have plenty of time. You're not at all tired, and it's easy for you to deliberate. And so in those situations, you're very inclined to deliberate. Sometimes you really have to decide quickly, or you're tired, or whatever. And there, it's very costly to deliberate, and so you're unlikely to do so. And so we'd make this model where it'd calculate what's the maximum cost you should be willing to pay in order to deliberate, and how does that depend on the environment that you're evolving in, and things like that.
That'll do for now. Someone else wants to make.
Okay, please, Biblatane. Oh.
Fantastic talk, David. This is Biblatane. Early in your talk, you talked about the emergence of clustering of cooperators. And I'm curious as to what extent you have thought about how those clusters could affect the development of intuitive feelings about cooperating with neighbors versus other people, and how that could lead to perhaps cultural differences in some of the processes you're talking about.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, how that works. So certainly one thing that we would expect, and that is actually a core part of this whole social heuristics idea, is an attempt to explain cross-cultural differences. Because if the idea is what your sort of the cross-cultural differences in sort of internalized norms, conceptions of what's appropriate behavior, et cetera, because if the idea is that you internalize the behaviors that are typically advantageous for you, then if you're living in a culture where there are strong institutions and there are good sort of external incentives to cooperate, there's a lot of observability, you're in a small town where everybody knows your business, things like that, then you wind up internalizing cooperation as your default, because that's the thing that's typically successful for you. Whereas if you live in a place where the norms are bad, where the institutions are bad, so you can get away with exploiting other people, then you wind up internalizing defection as your default. And so the key idea is this sort of quality of institutions, and by institutions I mean very broadly, not just the state, but by institutions I mean anything that sort of changes the strategic nature of the games, it changes the sort of payoffs. Those things that shape your payoffs affect what's optimal for you, and therefore affect what you internalize. And so I think that there's this very strong connection between those kind of the environment that you're in and the behavior that you internalize as sort of appropriate.
Thank you. So there can be a self-developing process, a social process that where the experiences across the group of people lead to differences in the cooperation.
Exactly. And so for the last experiment that I talked about, yeah, exactly. And the last experiment that I talked about, where we had them play the long or short repeated games, we think of that, and we actually in the paper we talk about it as a laboratory model of cultural differences, of different cultures. So sort of by randomly assigning people to different sets of institutional rules, we create different cultures within the lab, and we can reproduce a lot of these different measures of cross-cultural variation that people find in actual cross-cultural research. We can recreate those differences in the lab by assigning people to interact under different sets of rules.
Any last questions?
And in particular, in that one that I didn't have time to show here, is we use the World Values Survey question about trust. Oops, sorry. Well,
yeah, I'm interested.
which is a sort of standard measure of cross-cultural differences in social capital, and we recreate those same differences people see across countries in the lab by assigning to different conditions. Sorry about the lag. I'm done now.
Okay. I was interested, you talked about the dual processes and people that had this repeated game heuristic. It seems like it might be that some people would also have a kind of a one-shot game heuristic. And so I'm wondering to what extent you think the flip side could be plausible, that if you put these people with a one-shot heuristic in a repeated game, could it induce cooperation when they were allowed to deliberate more?
Yeah, that's definitely something that I would predict in general, although our computational model is pretty interesting. So the way this model works is we imagine that sometimes people play one-shot games, and with some probability they play one-shot games, 1 minus that probability they play repeated games. And then when they respond intuitively, they have to just choose cooperate or defect in a way that can't condition on the type of game that they're facing. Whereas when they deliberate, they can choose a different strategy depending on whether it's a repeated game or a one-shot game. And what we do with Nash equilibrium analysis or an evolutionary dynamics analysis both show that in that game, there's really only 2 different strategies that you get. One is if it's mostly one-shot games, then you get a strategy that never deliberates and just defects. And if there's a high enough probability of repeated games, then you can get a strategy that says, my intuition is to cooperate, because it's typically a repeated game, but I'm willing to pay some cost to stop and deliberate and switch to defection if it's a one-shot game. And so the thing is, you never get in that model, you never get a strategy that says, my intuition is to defect, but I will stop and deliberate and switch to cooperation if it's actually a repeated game. And the reason for that is that in order to get cooperation in repeated games, it's a coordination thing. So in a one-shot game, no matter what the other person does, it's always better to defect. But in the repeated game, it's only advantageous to cooperate if the other person is also going to cooperate. And so if when you calculate the sort of optimal probability of deliberating based on how likely it is that it's going to be a repeated game, and you say, well, I'll deliberate that often, I'll pay that sort of, this sort of maximum cost I'm willing to pay, but the other person, for the other person, it's only worth cooperating on the subset of times that you cooperate, so the optimal cost for them is lower, and you get this sort of spiral thing, and that equilibrium falls apart. So, sorry, I don't know how coherent that was, but we're almost done with the draft of that paper, where we sort of make a formal argument for why what you should expect is either people that are intuitive and selfish, or people that that sometimes deliberate and have an intuitive cooperation, but will deliberate and switch to defection if it's a one-shot game.
Okay, so thank you very much for say waking up say 6 o'clock in the morning to with us. So I think we are all kind of eager to have our dinner, and hopefully you are eager to have your breakfast as well, and maybe you're going back to sleep a bit more. So thank you very much again, and congratulations.
Yes, thank you guys so much for the invitation, and sorry that I couldn't be there in person.
Thank you.